just wish he knew. I just wish he knew.
Well, hello again. Welcome back to the Ninja Bunker, where we hang out and talk about war, the battle strategies involved therein. Today, we're going to be going over the War of 1812. Sorry if I sound like shit. Little under the weather, but that's okay. That's okay. We're gonna get into it in just a moment. Set a thing or two up here. By the way, this is gonna be the last war we go over with that as the intro video. It will be retired as the intro and will be moved to the outro. Yep, that's what's gonna happen. I have a new intro video that's basically already done. I mean, it's about 3/4 of the way done. But we're getting there. We are getting there. But all of those announcements and bullshit aside, yes, I'm wearing 3 sweaters. Calm down, don't shoot me. It's fucking cold. Holy shit. Alright. Anglo-American tensions originated in long-standing differences over territorial expansion in North America and British support for Tecumseh's Confederacy. Tecumseh's Confederacy, which resisted U.S. colonial settlement in the North Old West. These escalated in 1807 after the Royal Navy began enforcing tighter restrictions on American trade with France and impressed sailors who were originally British subjects, even those who had acquired American citizenship. Yep, trying to conscript American citizens into the British Royal Navy. Overstepping your bounds there, England. Opinion in the U.S. was split on how to respond, and although majorities in both the House and the Senate voted for war, they divided along strict party lines, with the Democratic-Republican Party in favor and the Federalist Party against. News of British concessions made in an attempt to avoid war did not reach the United States until July, by which time the conflict was already underway. Yeah, see, we need to have a Federalist Party again. I'm down for that. Fuck this two-sided Democrat-Republican shit. Let's get a Federalist up in there. Constitutional. That's it. If it's not constitutional, it ain't fucking happening. Game over. At sea, the Royal Navy imposed an effective blockade on U.S. maritime trade, while between 1812 and 14, British regulars and colonial militia defeated a series of American invasions on Upper Canada. Upper Canada. I don't have a picture of Upper Canada. That I did, but somehow the file got corrupt transferring it from my phone to my computer, so weird. Weird, right? The April 14 abdication of Napoleon allowed the British to send additional forces to North America and reinforce the Royal Navy blockade, crippling the American economy. Those British and their blockades. In August 1814, negotiations began in Ghent, with both sides wanting peace. British economy had severely impacted the trade embargo, while Federalists convened the Hartford Convention in December to formalize their opposition to the war. Hartford Convention. In August 1814, British troops captured Washington before American victories at Baltimore and Plattsburgh. In September, ended the fighting in the North. In the southeastern United States, American forces and Indian allies defeated anti-American faction of the Muskogee. In early 1815, American troops repulsed a major British attack on New Orleans while occurred during the ratification process, the signing of the Treaty of Ghent, which brought an end to the conflict. Ancient Muskogee Village and the Treaty of Ghent. Now, before we go in depth with the war, had a few people asking me about whether or not America got into the war because they saw an opportunity to steal land from the British. I did a lot of digging, because the first source I decided to read decided to tell me that, well, there was a debate about it, so I wanted to go find out, and there was a pretty big fucking debate about it. Shit. Some historians say yes, that was a primary factor, was that the United States wanted to expand territory. And because the British were at war with the French, made it a lot easier to fucking start that, right? Plus, we had just gotten Louisiana territory. So, the opposition to that is that would have been a positive byproduct, but was not the main source or the main reason that the United States declared war. Now, we're gonna go over this before we get into it, and that will complete today's episode. It's gonna be rather short because I feel like shit. When I say I am under the weather, I mean the weather is Big Bertha and I am under that bitch. Damn. Holy, I'm getting squished over here. Since the conclusion of the War of 1812, historians have long debated the relative weight of multiple reasons underlying its origins. During the 19th century, historians generally concluded that the war was declared largely over national honor, neutral maritime rights, and the British seizure of neutral ships and their cargoes on high seas. This theme was the basis of President James Madison's war message to Congress on June 1st, 1812. At the turn of the 20th century, much of the contemporary scholarship reevaluated this explanation and began to focus more on non-maritime factors as significant contributing causes as well. However, historian Warren H. Goodman warns that too much focus on these ideas can be equally misleading. Yes, it can. In disagreeing with those interpretations that have simply stressed expansionism and minimized maritime causation, historians have ignored deep-seated American fears for national security, dreams of a continent completely controlled by the Republican United States, and the evidence that many Americans believe that the War of 1812 would be the occasion for the United States to achieve long-desired annexation of Canada. Thomas Jefferson well summarized American majority opinion about the war to say the secession of Canada must be a sine qua non at a treaty of peace. Horseman. Historian Richard Mass argues that expansionist theme is a myth, and that it goes against the relative consensus among experts that the primary American objective was the repeal of British maritime restrictions. To what extent that American leaders considered the question of pursuing territory in Canada, those questions arose as a result of the war rather than the driving cause. Reginald Horseman sees expansionism as a secondary cause after the maritime issues. He notes that it was considered key to maintaining sectional balance between free and slave states thrown off by American settlement of Louisiana Territory. The Louisiana Territory. However, Horseman states that in his view, the desire for Canada did not cause the War of 1812. And that the United States did not declare war because it wanted to obtain Canada, but the acquisition of Canada was viewed as a major collateral benefit of the conflict. However, other historians believe that a desire to permanently annex Canada was a direct cause of the war. Alan Taylor says that many Democratic Republican congressmen, such as John Adams Harper, Richard Mentor Johnson, and Peter Buell Porter longed to oust the British from the continent and to annex Canada. A few Southerners opposed this, fearing that an imbalance of free and slave states if Canada was annexed. Anti-Catholicism also caused many to oppose annexing the mainly Catholic Lower Canada, believing its French-speaking inhabitants unfit for Republican citizenship. Even major figures such as Henry Clay and James Monroe were expected to keep at least Upper Canada in an easy conquest. Notable American generals such as William Hull issued proclamations to Canada during the war, promising Republican liberation through incorporation into the United States. General Alexander Smith similarly declared to his troops when they invaded Canada that you will enter a country that is to become one of the United States. You will arrive among a people who are to become your fellow citizens. However, a lack of clarity about American intentions undercut these appeals. Your ancestors fought in this. Well then, I figured my Canadian audience would enjoy this one. I figured they would, and you won. Yes, you did. You see, the way I look at it is, the U.S. let you guys down, because now you're dealing with Trudeau. Damn it. Had we just taken you guys over, it would have been, it would have been fine. It would have been fine. Right? It'd have been fine. I'm just messing around. David and Jeanne Heidler argue that most historians agree that the War of 1812 was not caused by expansionism, but instead reflected a real concern of American patriots to defend the United States. Neutral rights from the overbearing tyranny of the British Navy. That is not to say that expansionist aims would not potentially result from the war. However, they also argue otherwise, saying that acquiring Canada would satisfy America's expansionist desires, also describing it as a key goal of Western expansionists, who, they argue, believed that eliminating the British presence in Canada would best accomplish their goal of halting British support for tribal raids. They argue that the enduring debate is over the relative importance of expansionism as a factor, and whether expansionism played a greater role in causing the War of 1812 than American concern about protecting neutral maritime rights. In the 1960s, the work of Norman K. Risyard, Reginald Horseman, Bradford Perkins, and Roger Brown established a new Eastern Maritime Consensus. While these authors approached the origins of the war from many perspectives, they all conceded that British maritime policy was the principal cause of the war. Well, basically, come on. The Brits were trying to, conscribe American citizens into the Royal British Navy. And it wasn't going good for those conscribed citizens because they weren't viewed by Britain as, English loyalists, right? So they were often thrown to the fucking wolves first. It was kind of fucked up, the situation that those sailors were in, dude. As a historian, Norman Risyard notes a powerful motivation for the Americans was their threatened sense of independence and the desire to uphold national honor and in the face of what they considered British aggression and insults such as the Chesapeake Leopard Affair. H.W. Brand's writes, the other Warhawks spoke of the struggle with Britain as a second war of independence. Andrew Jackson, who still bore scars from the First War of Independence, held that view with the special conviction. The approaching conflict was about violations of American rights, but it was also about the vindication of American identity. Some Americans at the time, and some historians since, have called it a second war of independence for the United States. The young republic had been involved in several struggles to uphold what it regarded as rights and honor as an independent nation. I'm going to reread that. For those of you who think that you have natural-born rights, I'm just going to go ahead and reread this. The young republic had been involved in several struggles to uphold what it regarded as rights and honor as an independent nation. The only rights you have are the rights you can defend. Otherwise, you have no rights. The First Barbary War. The Barbary War, we're going to go over that one of these times. The First Barbary War had resulted in an apparent victory, but with the continued payment of ransoms. The Quasi-War against the French had involved a single-ship naval clashes over trade rights similar to the ones about to occur with Britain. Upholding national honor and being able to protect American rights was part of the background to the U.S. political and diplomatic attitudes towards Britain in the early 1800s. Had to be. At the same time, the British public were offended by what they considered insults, such as the Little Belt Affair. This gave them a particular interest in capturing American flagship President, an act that they successfully realized in 1815. They were also keen to maintain what they saw as their rights to stop and search neutral vessels as part of their war with France, and further ensure that their own commercial interests were protected. Britain was the largest trading partner of the United States, receiving 80% of American cotton and 50% of all other American exports. The British public and press resented the growing mercantile and commercial competition. Historian Reginald Horseman states that a large section of influential British opinion thought that the United States president represented a threat to British maritime supremacy. Damn right we did. And now who has the maritime supremacy? The United States. Oh. Ha ha ha. During the 7 Years' War, Britain introduced rules governing trade with their enemies. The Rule of 1756, which the U.S. had temporarily agreed to when signing the Jay Treaty, stated that a neutral nation could not conduct trade with an enemy if that trade was closed to them before hostilities had commenced. Since the beginning of Britain's war with France in 1793, the U.S. merchant marine had been making a fortune continuing trading with both nations. Damn right. The United States already starting off early playing both sides. That's fucking hilarious. America's share of transatlantic trade growing from 250,000 tons in 1790 to 981 tons in 1810 in the process. Gotta love the United States, man. Fuck. They were brilliant back then. They knew exactly what the fuck they were doing when they started a new country. Oh, man. Of particular concern to the British was the transport of goods from the French West Indies to France, something the U.S. would have been unable to do due to French rules during times of peace. The United States' view was that the treaty they had signed violated their right to trade with others, and in order to circumvent the rule in 1756, American ships would stop at a neutral port to unload and reload their cargo before continuing to France. These actions were challenged in the Essex case of 1805. With parts of the Jay Treaty due to expire in 1806, a new agreement was sought. The Monroe-Pinckney Treaty offered the U.S. preferential trading rights and would have settled most of its issues with Britain. However, the treaty did not moderate the rule of 1756 and only offered to exercise extreme caution and immediate and prompt redress with regard to impressment of Americans. President Thomas Jefferson, who had specifically asked for these 2 points to be extirpated, refused to put the treaty before the Senate. In 1806, Napoleon's Berlin Decree declared a blockade of the British Isles, forbade natural vessels harbor in British ports, and declared all British-made goods carried on neutral ships lawful prizes of war. The British responded in 1807 with orders in council, which similarly forbade any shipping to France. By 1807, when Napoleon introduced his Milan Decree declaring all ships touching at British ports to be legitimate prizes of war, it had become almost impossible for the U.S. to remain neutral. Between 1804 and 1807, 731 American ships were seized by Britain or France for violation of one of the blockades, roughly 2/3 by Britain. Since the Jay Treaty, France had also adopted an aggressive attitude towards American neutrality. While Britain, through a process known as preemption, compensated American ship owners for their losses, France did not. French frigates burned American grain ships heading for Britain and treated American sailors as prisoners of war. U.S.-French relations had soured so much by 1812, Madison was also considering war with France. As a result of these increasing trade volumes during the Napoleonic Wars, the United States Merchant Marine became the world's largest neutral shipping fleet. Between 1802 and 1810, it nearly doubled, which means that there were insufficient numbers of experienced sailors in the United States to man it. To overcome this shortfall, British seamen were recruited. British seamen were recruited, who were attracted by the better pay and conditions. It was estimated that 30%, 23,000 of the 70,000 men employed on American ships were British. During the Napoleonic Wars, the British Royal Navy expanded to 600 ships requiring 140,000 sailors. Dang. But let's be real though. America's starting off well. They're just like, hey, we pay better over here. Ha ha. Let's go. The Royal Navy could man its ships with volunteers in peacetime, but in wartime competing with merchant shipping and privateers for the pool of experienced sailors, it turned to impressment from ashore and at sea. Since 1795, the quota system had been used to feed men to the Navy, but it was not alone sufficient. Though most saw it as necessary, the practice of impressment was detested by most Britons. It was illegal under British law to impress foreign sailors, but it was accepted practice of the era for nations to retrieve seamen of their own nationality from foreign navies during times of war. However, in the 19 years Britain was at war with France prior to the War of 1812, some 10,000 American citizens were impressed into the British Navy. Dang! And you wonder why we were starting to get pissed about the British, man. They were just taking our people. And that's what I was saying earlier. Like, there's a lot of Americans that got fucking pulled into that shit. And conditions were not good for them. Like, conditions were just not. The American ambassador in London, James Monroe, under President Jefferson, protested to the British Foreign Office that more than 15,000 Americans had been impressed into the Royal Navy since March 1803. When asked for a list, however, the Madison administration was only able to produce one based on hearsay containing 6,257 names, many of which were duplicated. The list also included some who had legitimately volunteered to serve. By 1804, the incidence of impressment of Americans had sharply increased. Underlying the dispute was the issue that Britain and the United States viewed nationality differently. The United States believed that British seamen, including naval deserters, had a right to become American citizens. In reality, few actually went through the formal process. Regardless, Britain did not recognize a right for a British subject to relinquish his citizenship and become a citizen of another country. The Royal Navy therefore considered any American citizen subject to impressment if he were born British. American reluctance to issue formal naturalization papers and the widespread use of unofficial or forged identity or protection papers among sailors made it difficult for the Royal Navy to tell native-born Americans from naturalized Americans and even non-Americans, and led it to impress some American sailors who never been British. Though Britain was willing to release from service anyone who could establish their American citizenship, the process often took years while the men in question remained impressed in the British Navy. However, from 1793 to 1812, up to 15,000 Americans had been impressed, while many appeals for release were simply ignored or dismissed for other reasons. There were also cases when the United States Navy also impressed British sailors. Once impressed, any seaman, regardless of citizenship, could accept a recruitment bounty and was then no longer considered impressed but a volunteer, further complicating the matters. United States is like, fine, two can play at that game. American anger with Britain grew when Royal Navy frigates were stationed just outside American harbors in view of American shores to search ships for goods bound to France and impress men within the United States territorial waters. Well-publicized events outraged American public, such as Leander Affair and the Chesapeake Leopard Affair. The British public were outraged by the Little Belt Affair, in which the larger USS President, in search of the HMS Guerriere, instead of clashed with the small British sloop, resulting in the deaths of 11 British sailors. While both sides claimed the other fired first, the British public particularly blamed the United States for attacking a smaller vessel, with calls in some newspapers for revenge. The President had sighted and chased HMS Little Belt, trying to determine her identity throughout the afternoon. HMS Little Belt. The first shot took place after an exchange of hails had still failed to identify either ship to the other in a growing dusk. Damn it. After 45 minutes of battle taking place in darkness, Little Belt had received much damage, with several holes in her hull near the waterline and her rigging cut to pieces. President Captain Rogers claimed Little Belt had fired first, but he did not ascertain her size or country of origin until dawn. After sending over a boat, Rogers expressed regret and apologized for the unfortunate affair. Little Belt's Captain Bingham claimed the opposite. The President had fired first and had been maneuvering in such a way as to make him think she was planning an attack. Historian Jonathan Hooks echoes the view of Alfred T. Mahan and several other historians that it is impossible to determine who fired the first shot. Both sides held inquiries which upheld their captain's actions and versions of the events. Meanwhile, the American public regarded the incident as just retribution for the Chesapeake Leopard Affair and were encouraged by their victory over the Royal Navy, while the British regarded it as an unprovoked aggression. Dang. All right, more Canada. Oh, Canada. Whether the annexation of Canada was a primary American war objective has been debated by historians for years. Some argue it was an outcome of the failure to change British policy through economic coercion or negotiation, leaving invasions as the only way for the U.S. to place pressure on Britain. The view was summarized by the Secretary of State James Monroe, who said, "It might be necessary to invade Canada, not as an object of war, but as a means to bring it to satisfactory conclusion. Occupation would also disrupt supplies and colonies in the British West Indies and the Royal Navy, and prevent British armies arming their allies among the Indian nations of the Old Northwest." Nevertheless, even though President Madison claimed permanent annexation was not an objective, he recognized once acquired it would be difficult to relinquish. A large faction in Congress actively advocated this policy, including Richard Johnson, who stated, "I shall never die content until I see England's expulsion from North America and her territories incorporated into the United States. John Harper claimed the author of Nature himself had marked our limits in the south by the Gulf of Mexico and on the north by the regions of eternal frost. Both saw the war as part of a divine plan to unify U.S. and Canada, Johnson being its leading exponent. Others considered annexation of a matter of domestic economic and political necessity. Tennessee Congressman Felix Grundy was one of many who saw it as essential to preserve the balance between slave states and free states that might be disrupted by the incorporation of territories in the southeast acquired in 1803 Louisiana Purchase. Control of the St. Lawrence River, and the major outlet for trade between Europe and the Great Lakes region, was a long-standing American ambition, going back to the early years of the Revolutionary War and supported by powerful economic interests in the Northwest. Madison also viewed it as a way to prevent American smugglers using the river as a conduit for undercutting his trade policies. All these groups assumed American troops would be greeted as liberators, guaranteeing an easy conquest. Jefferson believed that taking Canada this year as far as Quebec will be a mere matter of marching, and will give us the experience for the attack on Halifax, the next and final expulsion of England from the American continent. In 1812, Canada had around 525,000 inhabitants, two-thirds of whom were French speakers living in Quebec. Upper Canada, now southern Ontario, had a population of less than 75,000, primarily Loyalist exiles and recent immigrants from the northeastern United States. The former were implacably hostile to the United States and later largely uninterested in politics and their loyalties unknown. Unlike the Texas annexation in 1845, they were too few to provide a critical mass of pro-American support. While many followed their loyalist neighbors and joined Canadian militia, absence of loyal backing prevented American forces from establishing a foothold in the area, and of 10 attempts to invade Upper Canada between 1812 and 1814, the vast majority ended in failure. Dang it. Ain't it The Old Northwest, a region between the Great Lakes, Ohio River, Appalachians, and the Mississippi, was a long-standing source of the conflict of 18th and early 19th century North America. This arose when settlers from the 13 colonies moved into lands owned by the indigenous inhabitants, a collection of Algonquian and Iroquoian-speaking peoples, chiefly Shawnee, Wyandot, Lenape, Miami, Potawatomi, Kickapoo, Menominee, and Ottawa. In 1783, the British ceded the Old Northwest to the United States and encouraged its citizens to settle in the region and ignored the rights of the tribes that inhabited it. In response, the tribes formed the Northwestern Confederacy, which fought American expansion in the Northwest Indian War. With military support from the British after signing the Jay Treaty with the U.S. in 1794, the British abandoned the tribes of the Old Northwest, who signed the 1795 Treaty of Greenville with the American government. Under the treaty, they ceded most of what is now the state of Ohio to the United States, but were granted title to the rest of their lands in perpetuity. When it signed the treaty, the American government had already decided to violate this provision and continue expanding into the Old Northwest. Damn it. A key factor in this policy was the acquisition by France of Louisiana Territory in 1800, which meant the U.S. faced an expansionist power on the northwestern border. Rather than a weak Spain, to ensure control of the upper Mississippi River, Jefferson incorporated the region into the Indiana Territory, which originally contained the modern states of Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. He appointed William Henry Harrison as governor, ordering him to acquire as much land as possible beyond the Greenville line, using deception if needed. In doing so, Harrison was helped by vague and competing claims, since tribes whose title to the lands was either limited or disputed were happy to sign them away in return for bribes. Although the December 1803 Louisiana Purchase ended in a French threat, between 1803 and 1805, they obtained extensive territorial secessions in the treaties of Fort Wayne, 1803, St. Louis, Vincennes, and Gooseland. The policies adopted by Harrison meant the low-level conflict between local tribes and American settlers escalated post-1803. 1805, the Shawnee leader named Tenskwatawa launched a nativist religious movement that rejected American culture and values, while his elder brother, Tecumseh, organized a new confederacy to defend their territory against settler encroachment. They established a community of Prophetstown in 1808, gaining support from young warriors and traditional chiefs, including Wyandotte leader Roundhead and Main Puck from the Potawatomi. The Sioux, Sauk, Meskwaki, and Ojibwe peoples who lived along the upper Mississippi and western Great Lakes initially rejected Tenskwatawa message because of their dependence on the fur trade, but continued settler incursions into their lands meant they too became hostile to the U.S. Britain traditionally maintained good relations with tribes of Old Northwest by handing out gifts, including arms and ammunition, after 1795. They ended this policy and advised the tribes to live peacefully with the American government. After the Chesapeake Leopard Affair in 1808, the British government began the Old Northwest as a buffer against American attack on Upper Canada. They started the distribution of gifts and offered the tribes a defensive alliance if the war broke out with the U.S., while urging them to refrain from aggressive action in the meantime. In 1809, Harrison acquired a large cession of land from the Delaware and Miami in the Treaty of Fort Wayne, partially by distributing hundreds of gallons of whiskey to Delaware and Miami negotiators. The cession included lands claimed by the Shawnee. Tecumseh insisted it was invalid without the consent of all tribes. In 1811, alarmed at the threat posed by Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, Harrison secured permission from the federal government to attack them. Taking advantage of Tecumseh's absence, he marched on to Prophetstown with an army of nearly 1,000 men. In the ensuing Battle of Tippecanoe, the Americans first repulsed an attack by forces under Tenskwatawa and destroyed Prophetstown. Fighting along the frontier escalated, while Tecumseh reconstituted his confederacy and allied with the British. Many Americans blamed the British rather than their own policy of expansion for the conflict in the Old Northwest. During the War of 1812, most of the tribes of the Old Northwest supported the British, including the previously neutral tribes of the Upper Mississippi. The United States was in a period of significant political conflict between the Federalist Party, based mainly in the Northeast, and the Democratic Republic Party, with its greatest power based in the South and West. Federalists, who favored a strong central government and openly sympathized with Britain in their struggle against Napoleonic France, were criticized by the Democratic Republicans for being too close to Britain, while the Federalists countered that the Democratic Republicans were allied with France, a country headed by Napoleon, who was seen as a dictator. A penis potato. Evidently not. He got it chopped off after he died during the autopsy, so evidently he wasn't a penis potato. By 1812, the Republicans, who were seen as being more supportive of Western expansionism, believed that the Federalists in New England were conspiring with the British, who were forming alliances with various frontier Indian tribes while recruiting late Loyalists in Canada to break up the Union. Instead, the war served to alienate the Federalists, who were ready to trade and even smuggle with the British rather than to fight them. By 1812, the Federalist Party had weakened considerably, and the Republicans were in a strong position, with James Madison completing his first term of office and control of Congress. Support for the American cause was weak in Federalist areas of the Northeast throughout the war, as fewer men volunteered to serve and banks avoided financing the war. The negativism of Federalists ruined the party's reputation post-war, as exemplified by Hartford Convention of 1814-1815, and the party survived only in scattered areas. By 1815, after the victory at the Battle of New Orleans, there was broad support for the war from all parts of the country. This allowed the triumphant Democratic Republicans to adopt some Federalist policies, such as the National Bank, which Madison reestablished in 1816. Man. Yeah, I just felt like that was all relevant. Felt like all of that was relevant before we get into the actual fighting and, the details of the war. How it went. What kind of losses happened. If there were any war crimes. Looking at you, Shane. Oh. The long-term consequences, stuff like that, Obviously, you had your American forces, you had your British forces, and you had your indigenous people, right? The highly decentralized bands and tribes considered themselves allies of and not subordinates to the British or the Americans. Various Indian tribes fighting along the United States forces provided them with their most effective light troops, while the British needed indigenous allies to compensate for their numerical inferiority. The indigenous allies of British Tecumseh's Confederacy in the west and Iroquois in the east avoided pitched battles and relied on irregular warfare, including raids and ambushes that took advantage of their knowledge of the terrain. In addition, they were highly mobile, able to march 30 to 50 miles a day. Their leaders sought to fight only under favorable conditions and would avoid any battle that promised heavy losses, doing what they thought best for their tribes, much to the annoyance of both Americans and British generals. The indigenous fighters saw no issue with withdrawing if needed to save casualties. They always sought to surround an enemy where possible to avoid being surrounded and make effective use of terrain. Their main weapons were a mixture of muskets, rifles, bows, tomahawks, knives, and swords, as well as clubs and other melee weapons. Sometimes had the advantage of being quieter than guns. Just wanted to throw that one out there, too. Shoutouts to the natives, fucking bunch of champions. Running around, tossing tomahawks, scalping people, the good old 1800, 1700 days. 1812, technically. It's the war we're going over. But I thought it was relevant. And I thought it was also kind of ironic that I decided yesterday, out of the 4 random things I had to choose from to go over for the history mystery box, which I thought was funny too. But I thought it was interesting that Washington ended up being the choice because we just did the fucking Napoleonic Wars. So, like, we've covered basically both sides of the Atlantic from, like, Washington's death up until 1812, the War of 1812 and beyond. Pretty good scope of information. Pretty large chunk of, war history right there. That's awesome. I like it. However, after the War of 1812, we're going to be doing some Ottoman Empire. Fredo, damn it, you need to tell me which war you want, or I'm just going to pick one. And no, it can't have anything to do with dang Vlad the Impaler. That's the Halloween episode. But, that being said, I think that's it for me for the night. I'm fucking exhausted. I want to go to sleep. I know it's not as late as it usually is when I end my stream, but dang. I am not feeling it. Ha! Actually I am. I'm feeling it pretty hard. It's fucking kicking my ass. That being said, there will not be a stream tomorrow night, as I will attempt to be on Verbal Combat over on Speakeasy's channel. Shout out to Speakeasy. And I will be back Saturday night into Sunday morning with the beginning of the war, probably all the way through to the end. I'll probably be able to get it all the way done in one episode. So be ready for Saturday. The rest of the War of 1812, potentially. That being said, my time with you has come to an end. And so to all of you out there, I hope you have a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, or night. Doesn't matter what time it is or where you're at in the world. Enjoy your time, because it may be limited. You never know. You might hold in that fart, and it explodes your intestines. Then you die of internal bleeding. Very unfortunate, but unlikely scenario. Even still, it's a possibility. It could happen. I'm sure it's happened at least one time throughout history where somebody has held in too many farts and their intestines have gone haywire. That being said, enjoy your time. Don't implode. Don't be stupid. Don't do anything I wouldn't do. Don't do anything I would not do my damn self. As for me, I am out. See y'all Saturday.
I just wish he knew. just wish he knew.